I knew I'd lost my children the moment the paramedic zipped my husband's body bag, not because of the death. Death doesn't end families, silence does. And silence was all I got from the two people who used to fight over who got to sleep beside me during thunderstorms. They stared at me like they were waiting for a confession I never owed. The world blurred around me, sirens, hospital corridors, condolences, but their eyes stayed razor-focused. Terrence clenched his jaw until his cheek jumped. Monique crossed her arms so tightly, her fingernails pressed crescent moons into her skin. My name is Sydney Hale, and on the day my husband died, my children turned me into someone they needed to escape. At the hospital, the doctor pulled us into a cold consultation room and said Leonard's heart failed under excessive stress. I felt the floor tilt. They felt validation. Terrence finally looked up at me, not with grief, but with something darker, something decided. At the funeral, they positioned themselves inches away from me as if they needed emotional distance to breathe. People kept whispering, "Your children will hold you through this." I wanted to ask, which children? The ones beside me in body or the ones who left me in spirit? If you're still watching, type in the comments what time it is where you are. It helps me remember I'm talking to people who won't look at me the way my children did that day. After the service, I tried to sit with them. Monique packed sandwiches with unnecessary force. Terrence rearranged chairs like the room offended him. I reached for him, gently. He flinched back, then said the sentence that slid right under my ribs like a blade. Dad would still be alive if home wasn't always so tense. He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need him to. My children had assigned me the role of villain in a story I wasn't even invited to narrate. That night, they went home alone. Left me to walk out of the funeral hall without a hand to hold. Said they'd call, promised they'd check on me. They didn't. The next day, I sent a photo of Leonard's roses. Opened. Ignored. Then a voice note. "I miss you both." Played. Unanswered. On the fourth day, I sent one last message, a mother's plea disguised as an invitation. "Come home. We don't have to talk. Just sit with me." Terrence opened it. Monique's typing bubbles appeared, then vanished. It was the last day my children ever acted like I existed. The house didn't go quiet all at once. It dimmed, piece by piece. First the phone that never rang, then the photo frames that started feeling like ghosts. I tried to keep my children's voices in the house any way I could. I sent Monique pictures of the backyard after the rain, how the roses bloomed like her father used to love. I recorded short voice notes for Terrence, little updates about groceries, the church bake sale, the weather turning. I kept my tone light, casual, like if I didn't sound sad, they'd have no reason to stay away. None of it worked. The messages stayed marked as seen, quiet as sealed tombs. Loneliness is a sound you start recognizing in small things. The hum of the refrigerator, the click of the porch light, the echo when you speak out loud just to remember what your own voice feels like. I told myself I was only giving them space, that maybe grief worked differently for them. But months started stacking up like folded laundry no one touched. I called Monique on her birthday, left a voicemail with a prayer and a laugh tucked into the same breath. She didn't call back. A week later I tried again, sent a small package hand cream she liked, a picture of me and her father smiling by the lake. It came back unopened. I started mailing smaller things, postcards, notes, recipes her grandmother taught me. Each time, I told myself I was keeping the door open, keeping love alive. But every envelope that returned was like a slap made out of paper. Terrence was colder in a quieter way. He never said cruel words, he just erased me with silence. When his work anniversary came around, I baked his favorite lemon pound cake, wrapped it carefully, and mailed it overnight. I imagined him cutting it, maybe sharing it with coworkers, maybe realizing I was still trying. The box came back 10 days later, the postal tape clean and sharp, a red sticker pressed across the top. Undeliverable as addressed. I'd written his address correctly. I knew what that really meant. The distance between a mother and her children isn't measured in miles, it's measured in unopened gifts, in messages that never find a voice at the other end. I'd walk through the house and touch things that used to feel like love. The mug Terrence bought me one Christmas, the photo album Monique once begged to take to her own house, All of it stayed here, with me. They had moved on, and I was becoming a chapter they didn't want to reread. In their silence, I tried to be understanding. They had their lives, their pain, their way of coping, but a mother's mind doesn't let her rest. Every night I'd lie awake, replaying every argument I could remember, every time I might have sounded sharp or demanding. I wondered if I'd leaned too hard on Leonard when he was alive, if they blamed me because I always called for help when I felt sick, because I let him carry too much. Maybe they saw that as weakness. Maybe they saw me as weight. And once he was gone, there was no one left to translate my love for them. It's a strange thing, trying to forgive people who are still alive but behave like you're gone. You keep reaching through glass, touching the outline of a family that no longer answers your knock. Months later, I packed another box. It wasn't big, just 2 framed photos, a birthday card, and a scarf Monique had given me years ago that I wanted her to have back. I dropped it at the post office with shaking hands, told the clerk to make sure it was delivered this time. He smiled politely, printed the label, and slid it into the bin. A week later, it reappeared on my porch like it never left. Same tape, same handwriting, a new red stamp across the front. Return to sender. The first sign was the tiredness. Not the kind that comes from crying or not sleeping, but the kind that lived inside my bones. I would stand up from the couch and feel like I had walked up a hill. Carrying a laundry basket from the bedroom to the washer left my heart fluttering too hard in my chest. My hands started slipping things, little tremors I tried to hide even from myself. At first I blamed it on grief and age. Widows are supposed to move slower. Widows are supposed to sit down more. Then the night sweats started. I would wake up with my nightgown clinging to my back, the sheets damp, the room cold but my body burning. I changed the pillowcases, folded fresh towels by the bed. I told myself it was stress, the weight of empty rooms pressing down on me. I kept moving, because if I stopped, I was afraid I would feel everything at once. One afternoon, I found a small knot high in my neck while rubbing the back of it, just a little swelling under the skin, tender when I pressed it. A week later, there were 2. My clothes began to hang off me. People at church said I looked smaller, slimmer, using soft words with hard eyes. I started sitting in the back pew, near the exit. Leaving early felt easier than staying and explaining a face they no longer recognized. I made an appointment at the clinic after I caught myself leaning against the kitchen counter just to catch my breath from stirring a pot. The nurse took my vitals, frowned, and left the room more than once. The air in that little exam room felt thick, like it had secrets. When the doctor finally came in, he did not sit right away. He looked at the chart first, then at me, and I saw something move behind his eyes, a kind of carefulness that made the hairs on my arms lift. He spoke slowly, choosing each word like it might cut me if he dropped it wrong. He said it was a type of blood cancer, called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He said it explained the weight loss, the sweats, the swelling. He outlined treatment in gentle strokes, like drawing a map for someone who had never left home. I heard chemotherapy. I heard aggressive but treatable. I heard you will need support. Support. That word landed harder than the word cancer. On the bus ride home, the city blurred past my window in long streaks of color. I held the folder of test results in my lap like it was somebody else's life. When I got home, I set it on Leonard's side of the bed. For a long time, I stood there, looking at his empty pillow, thinking about every night he had told me to call him if I ever felt strange or frightened. He would have picked up on the first ring. His children had not picked up in months. Still, I tried. My fingers knew both numbers without looking. I called Terrence first, straight to voicemail. I left a short message, my voice steady, telling him I had been to the doctor and needed to talk. I did not say the word cancer. I called Monique next. The phone rang, then clicked to silence. A few minutes later, my screen lit up with a text from her. "Mom, please don't make us responsible for everything." I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. Not a single word asking what the doctor had said. Not a single word checking if I was in danger. Just a boundary drawn in cold ink. In that moment, I understood something ugly and clear. They did not want information, because information might pull them back into my life. The next weeks moved like wet cement. Appointments, blood draws, scans, nurses speaking softly as they taped needles to my skin. I learned the sounds of machines that hummed and beeped and clicked, the rhythm of a waiting room where other people had hands to hold. I had a handbag, a cardigan, and a phone that stayed dark. The first day of treatment, I sat in a recliner under a thin blanket while a clear bag dripped medicine into my veins. Across from me, a woman about my age sat with a teenage granddaughter, their fingers laced the whole time. On my other side, a man had his wife reading to him from a worn paperback, her voice low and steady. The room was full of pairs. I was the only one alone. When the nurse finished disconnecting the line and taping fresh gauze to my arm, she wheeled me gently down the hall to the oncologist's office for discharge instructions. He went over side effects, emergency symptoms, things that might happen in the middle of the night. Then he paused, pen hovering over a blank line on a form. "If something happens and we can't reach you," he said, eyes kind but direct, "who should we call for emergencies?" I sat there, feeling the weight of every unanswered message, every unopened package, every silence. Then I swallowed, straightened my shoulders, and gave him the only honest answer I had. No one. The year after my diagnosis felt like living inside a waiting room that never emptied. Everything moved in cycles, appointments, blood work, treatments, while my life outside the hospital shrank down to what I could manage between waves of exhaustion. Still, in the middle of all that, I kept a small corner of my strength reserved for my children. I didn't know how to stop being their mother, even when they had stopped being my children. In the beginning, my updates to them were careful, almost polite. I sent short messages instead of long ones, thinking maybe I had overwhelmed them before. Treatment went okay today. Feeling a little tired. Saw a pretty sunset leaving the clinic. I attached pictures every now and then, the view from the hospital window, the flowers a lady from church dropped off, the casserole someone brought over. I made sure nothing looked too heavy. I thought if I stayed light, they wouldn't feel trapped. Most of the time, the messages showed delivered, and then stayed there, untouched. Every now and then, I could see one had been read. No reply. No, how are you? Just the quiet proof that my words had made it to their phones and stopped there. Holidays came, the way they always do, whether a house is full or empty. I put up a small tree that winter, nothing like the big ones we used to decorate when Terrence insisted on stringing the lights and Monique argued about ornament placement. I took a picture of the tree and sent it to both of them. "Thinking of you," I wrote. "Daddy would have loved this one." Terrence opened it. No response. Monique didn't even touch the message. As treatment wore me down, the distance between messages grew, not because I loved them less, but because my body stopped giving me the energy to chase people who didn't turn around. Some days I would pick up the phone, write half a sentence, then erase it. I started measuring my pain in the length of unsent texts. The hospital became the place where people said my name the most. Nurses called me Miss Sydney in soft voices when they came to check my vitals. Orderlies greeted me like a regular at a diner. There was one volunteer, a woman named Angela with a bright scarf and tired eyes, who started bringing magazines and puzzles to the infusion room. She noticed things without making a show of it. "You got folks bringing you home?" she asked one afternoon, setting a styrofoam cup of ginger tea on the little table beside me. I nodded out of habit, then stopped myself. "No," I said. "Just me. I drive myself on the good days. Take the bus when I can't." She sat in the empty chair next to mine for a moment, looking around at the other patients. Most of them had someone with them, a spouse, a friend, a church sister. She didn't say anything at first. Then she folded her hands and said, "You shouldn't be here by yourself this much." I could have explained. I could have said, "My husband is gone. My children are alive but absent." I could have recited every unanswered message, every unopened gift. Instead, I smiled a small smile that didn't have the energy to reach my eyes. "It's all right," I told her. "I'm used to it." Angela didn't push. She just nodded, like she understood more than I said, and squeezed my shoulder before moving on to someone else. Her touch lingered longer than most of my children's had in years. At home, I started talking less about my illness in the messages I did send. I stopped mentioning the hospital. Instead, I sent little neutral things. Saw a show you used to like on TV, drove past your old school today. No replies, no questions. It became clear they didn't want details, because details might come with responsibility. One evening, after a particularly rough treatment, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys, I decided to try one more time with Monique. Not a long message, not a plea. Just 3 words: I miss you. Simple, bare, nothing for her to misunderstand. I watched the screen. Delivered. Then a few seconds later, the status shifted strangely. The previous messages in the thread turned into small gray notifications. Messages to this number are no longer being delivered. My stomach went cold. I tried calling. The line didn't ring. It cut straight to silence, then to an automated voice telling me the number was unavailable. I backed out of her thread, checked it again, hoping I was mistaken. The same message stared back at me, small and brutal. My daughter had not replied. She had not called. She had not asked how my body was holding up under poison. She had chosen something cleaner, sharper, simpler. Without a word, without a reason, Monique had blocked my number. The morning I met him, my body felt like it had been scraped from the inside. The treatment the day before had hit harder than usual. My tongue tasted like metal, my legs dragged, and the light in the clinic hallway seemed too bright, like it was exposing every weak spot I had tried to hide. I sat in the exam room after my follow-up labs, hands folded in my lap, staring at the paper on the table crinkling under me each time I breathed. The door opened, and I braced myself for another white coat with rushed eyes and quick instructions. Instead, a tall man stepped in with his jacket folded over one arm, a stethoscope around his neck, and a kind of calm that didn't feel rehearsed. His hair was silver at the temples, his skin a deep brown mapped with the sort of lines that come from frowning at bad news too often. He didn't look straight at the chart first, like most of them did. He looked at me. "Mrs. Hale?" he said, voice low and steady. I nodded. "Sydney," I answered. "Just Sydney is fine." He gave a small smile, the kind that acknowledges a boundary instead of stepping over it. "I'm Dr. Victor Langston," he said. "I consult here at the clinic and run a survivorship program across town. Your oncologist asked me to look over your case." He sat, not behind the desk, but in the chair nearest to the exam table, closing the distance without crowding me. Up close, I could see tiredness in his eyes that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with what he saw for a living. He glanced at my file, then closed it gently. "How are you holding up with the treatments?" he asked. Most doctors ask that like a formality. He asked it like the answer actually mattered. I told him the truth in pieces about the fatigue, the night sweats, the way food sometimes turned to cardboard in my mouth. I did not mention the empty house or the silent phone. Those were injuries no lab could measure. He listened without interrupting, hands loosely clasped, body still. When I finished, he sat quiet for a moment, like he was weighing more than just dosage levels. "My wife went through chemo," he said finally. "Different cancer, but the same grind." Some days it felt like the treatment was trying to erase her before the disease did. He said, "My wife," the way people say the name of a country they no longer live in but still miss. There was no ring on his finger, only a thin mark where one used to sit. "She passed?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He nodded once. 3 years ago," he said. "She fought hard, so did we." He breathed out slowly. "I started the survivorship program because I watched too many people go through this with no support. No one should be alone during something like this." The word alone landed in the space between us. He didn't push. He didn't ask the question most people wanted to. "Do you have family?" He just let the invitation sit there, unspoken. There was a knock on the door, and a young woman peeked in, a slim girl in her early 20s with braids pulled into a neat bun and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad, they said your next patient is ready when you are," she said, then noticed me. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "This is my daughter, Ariel," he said, standing. "She's studying public health. Ari, this is Mrs. Sydney Hale." She gave me a polite smile, eyes warm but cautious, the way young people look at older strangers in hospital rooms. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Hale," she said. "Nice to meet you too, baby," I replied, the words slipping out with a softness I hadn't used in a long time. Another voice called from the hallway, something about a lab result, and Ariel disappeared as quickly as she'd come. He watched her go, then turned back to me. "I know you've heard a lot of information these past months," he said. "I won't pile more on top today. But if you're open to it, I'd like to see you regularly. Not just to watch the numbers, but to make sure you're not carrying this by yourself." "I don't want to be a burden," I said. The words came out too fast, revealing more than I planned. "People have their own lives." He studied my face for a moment. "Sometimes the heaviest thing we carry is the belief that needing help makes us a burden," he said quietly. "You're not. You're a patient. You're a person. That's enough." His pager buzzed. He glanced at it, then sighed. "I have to head to another unit," he said, standing. "But I'll be here when you come in for your next cycle. We'll talk more then." The next few weeks blurred into the rhythm of drip bags and beeping monitors. Each time I came in, I saw him in passing, walking down the hallway with a chart, speaking to a nurse, once standing by the vending machine on his phone, his expression drawn. Sometimes Ariel was there too, sitting in a corner with a laptop, headphones in, glancing up when patients shuffled past. There was another girl once, around the same age, with his eyes and a stack of textbooks under her arm. I heard someone call her Sierra as she handed him a coffee. On a particularly bad day, the treatment hit me so hard my knees buckled when I stood. The nurse caught my elbow, but my vision tunneled, the room swaying. By the time I made it to the end of the hallway, I had to lean against the wall, breath coming in short, shallow pulls. "Mrs. Hale?" I looked up. Dr. Langston was there, jacket over his arm, brow furrowed. "You don't look steady," he said softly. "How did you get here today?" "The bus," I answered, embarrassed. "I'll be all right." "I just need a minute." He set his jacket down on a nearby chair, the decision already made in his eyes. "No," he said. "You don't need a minute. You need someone." He picked up my bag before I could protest, his voice gentle but firm. "Come on, Sydney," he said. "Let me get you home safely." The first time he drove me home, I tried to apologize for every mile. "I live a bit out of the way," I said, fingers worrying the strap of my bag. "You didn't have to do all this. I know you're busy." Victor kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. "I'd rather know you got home safely than wonder if you fainted on a bus," he said. "That's not a favor. That's basic decency." The word decency felt strange in my chest. I hadn't been on the receiving end of it in a long time. His car was quiet, no radio playing, just the low hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of my own breathing as it began to even out. Streetlights slid across his face, carving his profile into silver and shadow. He didn't fill the silence with questions. He didn't pry into my family, my finances, my plans. He let the quiet be soft instead of sharp. "Do you always drive your patients home?" I asked finally. "No," he said, with the hint of a smile. "Just the ones I don't want collapsing in parking lots." I laughed before I realized I was laughing. The sound startled me. It sounded like it belonged to a different woman, one who remembered what it felt like to be at ease. We fell into a pattern after that. Not every appointment he was too busy for that, but on the particularly heavy treatment days, if he happened to be on the floor when I finished, he'd check on me. Sometimes it was just a hand on my shoulder and a, "You good to get home?" Other times, when my legs wobbled or my eyes refused to focus, he'd pick up my bag and say, "Come on, I'm heading that way." One afternoon, rain came down so hard the parking lot looked like a shallow river. He walked me to the car with his jacket over both our heads, the two of us moving in a lopsided shuffle, shoes splashing. When we reached the car, we ducked in, both of us damp and breathless. I caught myself smiling at him, not because anything was funny, but because something in my body had loosened in his presence. "You're smiling," he said quietly, adjusting the heater. "That's good to see. I hadn't realized I was." Weeks later, he mentioned in passing that he lived not too far from me, over in an older neighborhood with big trees and porches that had seen decades of summers. One especially rough day, When the nausea wouldn't settle and my hands wouldn't stop shaking, he hesitated before taking the turn toward my street. "Would you mind a small detour?" he asked. "I need to grab something from the house, and I'd rather you sit on a couch than try to crawl into your bed alone like this." I almost said no. Years of feeling like a burden rose up in my throat. Then I saw the way he watched me, not pitying, just measuring my weakness against the reality of the afternoon. "All right," I said. A small detour. His house stood on a corner lot, brick with white trim and a porch swing that moved slightly in the wind. Inside, it smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner, like a place people lived, not just slept. Family photos lined the hallway, 2 girls at different ages, a woman with kind eyes and a headscarf in some of them, without it in others. He didn't rush past the frames. He walked through them, like a man who had made peace with both presence and absence. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a deep couch in the living room. "I'll make some tea." I sat on the edge at first, spine straight, hands folded, waiting for the feeling that I needed to explain why I was there. It didn't come. Instead, I heard soft footsteps above us, and a moment later, Ariel came down the stairs in sweatpants and a college hoodie, textbook tucked under her arm. "Oh," she said, surprised but not annoyed. "Hi, Mrs. Hale." "Hey, baby," I replied, the nickname slipping out again. It felt less dangerous this time. "Dad, you want me to slice the lemon?" she called toward the kitchen. "Please," he answered. She moved easily around the room, not treating me like an intruder or a fragile patient, just a person who happened to be sitting on her couch. A few minutes later, another young woman came in through the front door, shaking rain from her umbrella. Sierra. She took in the scene with quick, assessing eyes, then nodded at me. "Hi," she said. "You're one of Dad's patients, right?" "Yes," I answered. "Sydney." She smiled, a real one, small but sincere. "Nice to meet you, Miss Sydney." It was simple, but it did something to me. No one had called me nice to meet in a long time. Most people met me as a diagnosis, a widow, a bless her heart. In this house, I was just a woman on a couch, drinking hot tea from a mismatched mug. We didn't talk about cancer. We talked about traffic, the best soul food spot near the hospital, the way the rain made the streetlights look like melted gold on the pavement. I found my shoulders lowering, my body finally understanding it didn't have to brace itself in every room. When he walked me back to the car later, the sky had softened to a mist. He opened the passenger door, then paused, one hand resting on the frame. "You know you don't have to do this alone," he said. I opened my mouth to protest, to say the words I always said, "I'm fine, I don't want to bother anyone, people have their own lives." He shook his head gently before I could speak. "You don't have to be alone in this fight, Sydney." Healing didn't arrive like a miracle. It came in inches, one less night sweat, one meal I could keep down, one morning when I realized I had walked from the bedroom to the kitchen without needing to lean on the wall. The scans began to show what my body already suspected. The treatment was working. Slowly, the dark patches on the images shrank. Slowly, the doctors stopped using words like aggressive and started saying responding. My reflection shifted too. My face was still thinner than the woman Leonard had kissed goodbye before work every morning, but there was color creeping back into my cheeks. My eyes didn't look so hollow, so hungry for something I could never quite name. I caught myself humming once while washing dishes, and the sound startled me the way my own laughter had in Victor's car months earlier. At the clinic, my recliner in the infusion room became less of a battlefield and more of a station. I recognized people now, the woman with the bright headscarf who always brought her sister, the older man who fell asleep as soon as they started the drip, the young mother who clutched her phone like it was the only thing tethering her to the world outside. I knew their faces, their winces, the way they scanned a room looking for a soft place to land. I didn't mean to start helping anyone. It happened in small ways. One day, a lady in the chair across from me couldn't figure out how to adjust the blanket without tangling her IV line. I showed her how to tuck the edge under her arm so it didn't pull. Another day, a man's wife had to step out to take a call, and he started breathing too fast, panic rising in his eyes. I told him about the first time I heard my machine beep for no reason and thought it meant I was dying. We laughed about it until his shoulders dropped. Word must have traveled, because nurses started saying things like, "Mrs. Hale, can you sit next to Miss Johnson while we get her settled?" Or, "Would you mind talking to the new patient for a minute?" It helps when it comes from someone who's already in the chair. I found myself telling pieces of my story without spilling all of it. I spoke about fear, yes, but also about mornings after fear, when you still had to get up and choose clothes and brush your teeth. I talked about food that didn't make me nauseous, songs that helped drown out the beeping, little routines that made the treatments feel less like punishment and more like maintenance. One afternoon, I was in the small lounge off the main hall, sipping weak coffee and talking to a woman who had just started her second cycle. She was shaking, fingers drumming against the paper cup. I told her about the time I thought I couldn't do another round and did anyway. I told her about breathing through it, about letting the medicine feel like work being done instead of damage being done. "You talk like someone who found purpose again," a voice said from the doorway. I turned. Sierra stood there, backpack hanging off one shoulder, her hair pulled into a braid over one collarbone. She had come to drop off something for her father and had clearly caught more of my conversation than I realized. "Don't mind me," she added quickly, holding up her hands. "I'm just passing through." The woman I'd been talking to smiled weakly and excused herself to the restroom. Sierra walked over and leaned against the counter, studying me with an expression that made me feel seen. "I just tell them what I needed somebody to tell me," I said. "That's kind of the point," she replied. "Most people sit here and talk about numbers and fear. You sound like you're talking about life, like you actually see something on the other side of all this." I let her words sit there. Life. Something on the other side. For a long time, my future had felt like a hallway that just narrowed and narrowed until it disappeared. Lately, there were doors again. Not all of them open yet, but there. I went a long time without seeing anything, I admitted. Now I'm just trying not to waste what my body fought this hard for. She nodded slowly, then tilted her head. "Do your kids know how you talk like this?" she asked. "Feels like the kind of thing I'd want my mother to say to me if I were scared." I didn't flinch this time. The ache was still there, but it no longer swallowed my voice. "I haven't heard from my children in years," I said plainly. "They made their choice. I had to make one too." Sierra's eyes softened, something like respect mixing with sadness. "Their loss," she murmured. That evening, as I gathered my things from the chair in the infusion room, Victor appeared beside me. He had that end-of-day look, tie loosened, shoulders heavy, but his eyes were bright. "I heard you held court in the lounge today," he said. "Nurses said there was a whole row of people listening to you talk about breathing through fear." I chuckled. "I just talk. They're the ones doing the hard part." He shook his head. "What you're doing matters," he said. "You're giving people something medicine can't." He walked with me down the corridor, our steps in quiet sync. At the door leading out to the parking lot, he stopped. "Sydney," he said, and there was a different weight to my name this time. I turned to face him. "I've gotten to know you as a patient, as a fighter, as someone who makes other people braver just by sitting next to them." He hesitated, then let a small, genuine smile appear. "I'd like to know you as more than that," he continued. "If you're willing, I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as your doctor, as a man who admires the woman you are." We didn't get married in a grand hall or a church with stained glass and a choir. We chose a room that felt like breath, a small event space attached to a restaurant downtown, with soft light, simple flowers, and chairs arranged in a loose circle instead of rigid rows. Victor said he wanted it that way. "I've had enough of rigid things," he told me. "Let's do something that feels like us." I wore a dress that moved when I did, nothing more. Soft fabric, the color of cream, sleeves that skimmed my wrists, a neckline that did not fight for attention. No train, no crystals, no veil cascading down my back. I'd done the big dress years ago with Leonard. This time, I wanted to feel like myself, not a costume designed for other people's eyes. My hair was pulled back simply, silver threads glinting in the light, a quiet crown I had earned. Victor stood at the front with his jacket open, tie a shade darker than his suit. His eyes never left mine as I walked toward him. Ariel and Sierra sat off to one side, each holding a small bouquet, dresses neat but not matching. They weren't playing bridesmaids, They were just his daughters, showing up for their father on the day he tried to rebuild. There were maybe 20 people there, a few of his colleagues, a neighbor who had brought him soup after his wife died, Angela from the hospital, who had insisted on coming when she heard. No one from my bloodline, no cousins, no distant aunts, no children slipping in through the back door to avoid a scene. The empty space where my side of the room should have been did not swallow me. It simply told the truth. The officiant spoke words about second chances and time, about how life doesn't always give us what we think we deserve, but sometimes hands us what we're brave enough to accept. Victor's hand was warm in mine, pulse steady, thumb brushing against my knuckles in small, grounding strokes. "Do you, Victor Langston, take Sydney Hale?" the officiant began. I listened, answered when it was my turn, felt the weight of each vow land somewhere inside my chest. When he slid the ring onto my finger, something loosened a knot I had been carrying since Leonard's heart stopped, and my children's love followed it out the door. "Do you, Sydney, take Victor?" came next. "I do," I said. The words did not tremble. They sat solid on my tongue, anchored in everything we had already walked through together. When we were pronounced husband and wife, there was no roar of applause, no camera flashes, just soft clapping, a few sniffles, and the sound of Victor's quiet exhale as he leaned his forehead against mine for a moment. In that small pause, with his breath mingling with mine and my ring still warm from his hand, I made a vow no one heard but me. I will never beg for love again, not from a man, not from my children, not from anyone who cannot see me standing right in front of them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was a line drawn in the dust of all the years I had spent chasing people who ran from me. At the reception, such as it was, we ate simple food, roasted chicken, vegetables, a small cake with fresh fruit on top instead of towering tears. Music played low enough that people could talk without shouting. I sat between Victor and an empty chair that no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like a boundary. Ariel tapped a spoon against her glass gently. "I don't have a speech," she said, cheeks coloring. "I just want to say, I'm glad Dad smiles different now." She glanced at me. "Thank you for being part of that." Sierra stepped forward next, holding her glass with both hands. "We miss our mom every day," she said, voice steady. "Nothing will ever change that, but seeing Dad with someone who understands pain and still chooses joy, that matters to us." She lifted her glass slightly in my direction. "To Sydney, we're grateful you're here." There were no declarations of, "You're our new mother," no sudden rush to erase the woman who came before me, just respect, just room for me to exist without proving I had earned it. Later, while Victor spoke to a colleague near the doorway, I stepped aside to look at the little table that held our marriage license and the guest book. My new name sat there in black ink, Sydney Langston. I traced the letters lightly with one fingertip. The woman who had signed that line was not the same woman who used to stare at her phone, willing it to light up with her children's names. As I stood there, watching my new name dry on the page, I heard Victor's voice shift into that professional tone he used when speaking about work. "Yes, this is Dr. Langston," he said, phone pressed to his ear. "A feature?" He glanced over at me, eyes flickering with surprise and something like cautious excitement. "The Survivorship Foundation," the voice on the other end must have said, because his mouth curved into a thoughtful line. "That's right," he replied slowly. "My wife and I are co-founders. Tell me more about what you have in mind." We named it the Hardy Survivorship Foundation because Victor said surviving required a certain hardness that didn't look tough from the outside. "People think strength is loud," he told me one night at the kitchen table, our hands wrapped around cups of tea. "Most of the strongest people I've treated barely raise their voices." He wanted a space for those people, for the ones who had walked through fire with no one holding their coat. He didn't ask me to be involved as a favor. He asked me because, in his words, "You've been living the mission before it had a name." At first, I thought he meant small things, speaking to patients in the lounge, letting nurses seat newcomers beside me. But he had more in mind. He slid a folder across the table with draft documents and a simple line that made my hands tremble a little when I read it. "Co-founders, Dr. Victor Langston and Mrs. Sydney Langston." I stared at those words for a long moment. Co-founder. Not assistant, not volunteer, not helping out. My name sat next to his like it belonged there. The woman who used to stand in empty rooms waiting for a phone to ring did not vanish, but she shifted. She made room for this version of herself. In the months that followed, the foundation started as most things worth anything do in tight rooms with mismatched chairs, coffee that had been on the warmer too long, and people with tired eyes who still showed up. We hosted support circles at the clinic on Saturdays. Some days 3 people came, some days 10. We listened, we shared, we let them say things they couldn't say at home. Victor handled the medical explanations, the diagrams, the questions about side effects and statistics. I handled the silences. I spoke about sitting in waiting rooms alone, about walking out of buildings full of people and still feeling like the only person in the world. I told the truth without dressing it up or dragging it into despair. I never want to lie to you, I would tell them. Some days hurt all the way through, but you're still here. That means something. Your body fought for today. Don't pretend that doesn't matter. Word began to spread quietly. A nurse recommended our group to a patient who hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. An oncologist sent a husband who didn't know how to stand beside his wife without trying to fix her. We printed flyers on simple white paper and taped them near elevators and coffee stations. It wasn't flashy. It was necessary. The medical community noticed, but not in a spotlight way at first. A social worker approached me after one session and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I've never seen Mrs. Turner talk that much. A resident doctor stopped me in the hallway, eyes thoughtful. "I sat in the back today," she said. "The way you describe fear, I think that might help me listen better to my patients." Producers started coming around because of Victor. He was the doctor, the one with years of experience and titles. When a local health network decided to film a small piece about post-treatment care, they scheduled time with him in his office. I was supposed to be in the background that day, greeting people, making sure coffee cups weren't empty. The crew set up cameras, lights blooming against the walls like artificial suns. Cables snaked across the floor. A woman with a clipboard and a headset introduced herself as Denise, the segment producer. She shook Victor's hand, then glanced at me. "And you are?" she asked, not dismissive, just trying to place me. "This is my wife, Sydney," Victor said. "She co-founded the foundation with me. Honestly, she's the reason half the people keep showing up." I expected the polite nod people give when they hear wife. Instead, Denise tilted her head, curiosity sharpening. "Is that right?" she asked. "What do you do in the sessions, Mrs. Langston?" "I sit," I answered. "I listen. I tell them the truth about what it felt like when I went through my own treatment without much support at home." Her eyes flicked up at that. "Without support?" she repeated. "You went through cancer treatment alone?" "Not completely alone," I said. "God was there, the doctors, a few kind strangers, but the people I expected to hold me didn't. So I tried to be the person I needed back then." Something in her face changed. She scribbled a note on her clipboard, then looked back at me. "Would you mind saying that again once we're rolling?" she asked. "Not like a speech. Just like you're talking to one of your patients." The interview they had planned with Victor stretched. They filmed him talking about long-term side effects, about depression after remission, about how the system often forgets survivors once the big crisis passes. Then Denise turned one of the cameras toward me where I sat in one of our circle chairs. She didn't ask for a grand story. She asked me simple things. What did it feel like to sit in that chair as a patient? What keeps you coming back to help? What do you say to someone who feels abandoned? I answered the way I always had, with honesty and no polish. I spoke about the first time I walked into the infusion room and saw every chair filled except the one next to mine. I described the weight of holding fear in your throat so it doesn't spill out and make other people uncomfortable. I talked about the day I realized the people I loved most were not coming to help me carry the sickness, and how I decided I would not let that teach me to withhold care from others. Denise watched me carefully the whole time, not just listening but measuring. When the cameraman signaled they had enough footage, she crossed the room and sat in the empty chair beside me. "You have a way of making something heavy feel survivable," she said. We're doing a televised launch special for the foundation next month. Initially, we planned to focus on Dr. Langston as the medical expert. She paused, then smiled slightly. I'd like you to be part of that segment too, Sydney, on camera. As the heart of this work, the studio lights were brighter than any hospital lamp I had ever lain under. They washed the room in a soft glare that made everything look a little less sharp, a little less dangerous. A woman with a headset dabbed powder along my forehead and nose, then stepped back to check the monitor. On the screen, I looked like myself and someone else at the same time. Sydney Hale turned into Sydney Langston, sitting in a chair with her back straight and her hands folded loosely in her lap. "Just talk like you do in your sessions," Denise said, crouching beside me. "Forget the cameras. Pretend it is one of your people in front of you." I nodded. Pretending was not necessary. I could feel them already, the women and men who sat in plastic recliners with blankets over their knees, the ones whose eyes tracked every movement in a room because they were afraid to blink and miss something important. Victor sat to my left, suit pressed, tie neat, posture easy. The host stood between us, cards in her hands, smile shaped for television. Behind the cameras, crew members moved with contained urgency. A screen on the side showed the channel's logo and the segment title, Hardy Survivorship Foundation, Life After Treatment. A red light blinked on. The host's voice shifted into its broadcast cadence. "We are here today with Dr. Victor Langston and his wife Sydney," she began. They co-founded the Hardy Survivorship Foundation, a program dedicated to supporting cancer survivors long after the last treatment drip. "Dr. Langston, tell us how this began." Victor spoke first about medicine and gaps in the system, about patients discharged with a folder and no roadmap for their hearts. He used gentle language, careful enough that people at home would not feel lost. Then the host turned to me. "And you, Mrs. Langston," she said. "You went through this yourself. What made you want to sit in those rooms with other survivors?" I took a breath and let my eyes soften, not toward the camera, but toward a fixed point just beyond it. I pictured the first infusion chair I had ever sat in alone. I pictured my phone, dark in my handbag. "I went through treatment with very little family support," I said. My voice did not shake. "I had nurses, doctors, a few kind strangers. But inside the walls of my own life, it was quiet, too quiet. I learned how to hold my fear in my body so it did not spill over onto people who had already decided they had given enough. The studio was so still I could hear the faint buzz of the lights. I healed alone," I continued, "but I did not stay alone. Somewhere along the way, I met people who pulled up chairs beside my pain instead of walking around it. I wanted to become that kind of person for someone else, not to save anybody, just to sit still with them until they remember their life is still worth fighting for." The host's eyes glistened in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Denise gave a small, almost imperceptible nod from behind the cameras. The red light blinked off, then on again as they rolled through different angles, cutaway shots, details of group sessions, soft footage of me pouring coffee, Victor adjusting a chair in a circle. By the time the segment finally aired, weeks later, I had almost forgotten how it felt to sit under those lights. Life moved on, appointments, foundation meetings, dinners at home with Victor and the girls. The broadcast was scheduled for a Sunday evening during a health special on local television. We watched from our living room, plates from dinner stacked in the sink, a blanket over my legs. The host's polished voice floated through the speakers as images flashed. The clinic hallway, the room where we held support sessions, a shot of the foundation's modest office. On screen, a lower third banner appeared over my image. Sydney Langston, co-founder, Hardy Survivorship Foundation. My face filled the frame. Silver at my temples, lines at the corners of my mouth, eyes steady. I heard my own voice say, clear and gentle, "I healed alone, but I didn't stay alone." Somewhere across the city, a television sat on a wall in a sports bar where the sound usually stayed low. Tonight, the bartender had turned it up a little for the health segment, something to break up the noise of scores and commercials. Terrence sat at the counter, nursing a drink he had not really wanted, mind tangled in numbers that refused to add up for his business. He glanced at the screen out of habit, more to rest his eyes than anything else. The first thing he recognized was the curve of my mouth. Time had narrowed my face, but there were certain things age could not erase. The caption caught him next. The name Langston made his brow crease, but the first name pulled him forward on the stool. Sydney. He heard my voice, older but familiar, talking about fear and loneliness as if they were people he had once met. He watched me sit in a room full of survivors, hands open, shoulders relaxed, not the fragile woman he had sealed in his memory and stepped away from. At another house across town, Monique stood in her kitchen with the television on in the background while she scrolled through her phone, bills stacked on the counter like accusations. A phrase slipped past the noise and caught her attention. I healed alone, but I didn't stay alone. She turned, dish towel in her hand, and saw my face on the screen. Her grip loosened, the towel fell to the floor. There I was, alive. Not in a hospital gown, not in a dark living room, on television, sitting next to a man whose hand rested near mine. Our bodies angled toward each other with the ease of people who had walked side by side for a long time. They watched me laugh softly, watched the host call me co-founder, heard talk of grants and programs and community partnerships. They heard Victor say, "my wife," in a tone that made it clear this was no charity arrangement. Terrence's heart thudded against his ribs. The numbers on his spreadsheet, the late notices on his email, the quiet panic he had been swallowing for months, all of it pressed closer around him. He swallowed hard, eyes still fixed on the screen, and his voice came out low, almost hoarse. "We need to reach out." The morning after the television segment aired, I woke up to sunlight spilling through the blinds and the smell of coffee already brewing. Victor was in the kitchen, humming low under his breath, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had built his morning around peace. The air felt different that day, lighter somehow, but not because of fame. I hadn't done it for recognition. I had simply told the truth, and for once, the truth had been enough. My phone sat face down on the table beside the bed. When I finally reached for it, I saw the notification, two names I had not seen on my screen in more than 2 decades. Monique, Terrence, both unread, both from early that morning. My heart didn't race. It didn't even skip. It just stilled, like it was waiting to see if the universe was joking. I opened Monique's first. "Mom, can we see you? We want to talk." The sentence sat there, small and sudden, as if 25 years of silence could be swept aside with 8 words. Terrence's message arrived 5 minutes later. The same text, copied, pasted, slightly rearranged punctuation, as if they had coordinated the wording before sending. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't know what to feel, but because there was nothing left to feel that hadn't already been burned out years ago. Victor came in quietly, mug in hand. "You're awake," he said, setting it down beside me. Then he caught my expression. "Something wrong?" I turned the phone toward him. "It's them." He looked at the messages for a moment, then back at me. 25 years, he said softly. "And that's what they lead with." I nodded. The ache that used to live under my ribs stirred faintly, but it didn't grow. I had built too much peace to let it. "They saw the interview," I said. "That's why." He didn't have to ask how I knew. Money has a certain sound when it enters a conversation, even unspoken. It wasn't just that they wanted to talk. It was that they wanted to talk now after seeing the foundation, after hearing about partnerships and funding, after realizing that the woman they left behind had not only survived, but built something they couldn't access. Victor sat beside me, his hand covering mine. "Answer only if it brings you peace," he said. "Not guilt, not curiosity, peace." I nodded again, though my fingers stayed still over the phone. Peace wasn't what they were offering. It was what I had built without them. I didn't respond. Not that hour, not that day. The phone buzzed again around noon, another message from Terrence. "We just want to talk, Mom. It's important." Then another, this time from Monique. "I didn't know you were doing that kind of work. We're proud of you." The words read like something rehearsed, like she'd Googled what remorse was supposed to sound like. I could almost hear her voice, too careful, too practiced. She'd always been good at saying the right thing when she needed something. By evening, 3 more messages came through, each one shorter, more impatient than the last. "We've been trying to call. Mom, please answer. It's urgent." I didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not after everything I had lived through. I knew that Terrence's business had been struggling before I cut ties. Word traveled through quiet channels. Monique's marriage, too shaky, leaning on borrowed money. Their sudden urgency wasn't about reconciliation. It was about access. They saw my peace, my security, my second chance, and mistook it for an open door. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't move to check it. I took a sip of coffee and stared out the window instead, the early light soft against the trees. Victor reached over, pressed the edge of the mug closer to me. "You don't owe them a conversation," he said. "Sometimes silence is the only truth people understand." I let the words settle. 25 years ago, silence had been something forced on me, painful, lonely, unbearable. Now it was something I chose. And that difference felt like freedom. The phone lit up once more. This time, the message preview showed part of a new sentence from Terrence. "Mom, please, we're desperate." The screen dimmed before I could read the rest. I didn't touch it. The sound of another incoming text followed a few seconds later, then another, the rhythm of panic. By the third day of messages, the sound of my phone buzzing no longer startled me. It just confirmed what I already knew. They wanted something they didn't know how to name without sounding selfish. The screen lit up with their names over and over, but I left it face down on the coffee table and moved around it like a piece of furniture I had decided not to trip over anymore. Victor was at the clinic, Ariel and Sierra busy with their own lives. The house was quiet, but not empty. It held my footsteps, my breath, the small noises of a woman who had learned how to live without waiting on anyone's arrival. Still, the messages hovered in the back of my mind like a fly that refused to die. Not because I wanted to answer, but because I wanted to finally say the things I had swallowed for 25 years. I took out a yellow legal pad from the drawer in the sideboard, the kind Leonard used to use for his lists. I sat at the dining table, where bills and foundation brochures now lived, smoothed the first page, and wrote their names at the top. Monique, Terrence. My hand hesitated for a moment, then settled. The pen felt heavier than it was. I started with the day of the funeral. The way they angled their bodies away from me on the front pew, how Terrence's sentence, "Dad would still be here if things were calmer at home," had cracked something in me that never fully sealed. I wrote about the first holidays without them, about the tree I decorated alone, the cake I baked and sliced for people who were not my children because my children had other places to be. I moved through the years the way you trace scars on your own body slowly, with familiarity and a slight disbelief that you had survived each cut. I wrote about envelopes that came back unopened, boxes stamped "Return to Sender," voice notes played but never answered. I wrote about sitting in waiting rooms while other people's names were called, followed by, "Your family is here," and hearing only my own name bounce back at me. The words didn't come out pretty. They came out raw. Not to hurt them, but because I needed to see my own life in ink instead of just memory. I told them how shame had become a second skin shame, that my husband died and they chose blame over comfort. Shame that I kept calling, kept trying, kept sending pieces of myself to people who had made it clear they no longer wanted stock in me. I confessed something I had never said aloud, that there were nights I lay in bed wondering if my absence from their lives made them happier, if my silence made it easier for them to breathe. I told them I had accepted that thought once, held it close like punishment I deserved. Then I told them the truth that had replaced it, that their decision to live without me did not mean I was unworthy of love. It just meant they were unwilling to give it. My hand cramped, but I kept going. I wrote about the clinic, about sitting in recliners with no one by my side, about the first time someone reached for me without asking for anything in return. I described meeting Victor without using his name, just calling him the man who pulled a chair up next to my pain. I told them how I had rebuilt my life from the rubble they left behind, not to rub it in, but to make it plain. Their absence had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Somewhere around the third page, I stopped writing about them and started writing about myself. I wrote that I did not recognize the version of me who used to watch the clock for their calls, who memorized their schedule so she'd know when they were too busy to be bothered. I wrote that I remembered her, that I honored her, but I did not live as her anymore. The woman holding the pen now had drawn a line on her wedding day and promised herself never to beg for love again. When I reached the end, my chest felt hollow in a clean way, like a room that had finally been cleared of old boxes. I read the letter once, quietly. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't pleading. It was a record, a witness statement from my own heart. Then I tore it down the middle, not in anger. The sound of paper ripping felt gentle, almost merciful. I tore each page again and again until the words were nothing but strips, then gathered them into a pile. For a moment, I pressed my palm over the pieces, thanking the woman who had needed to write it and releasing the woman who no longer needed it sent. In the silence that followed, my phone buzzed again on the coffee table. This time, I picked it up. A new message from Monique stared back at me, the desperation no longer hidden under soft words. "Mom, can we please meet before things get worse for us?" The message about "before things get worse for us" cracked something open not in me, but in them. After that, the tone shifted fast. Guilt came first, neatly dressed. "Mom, we know we haven't been perfect," Monique wrote. "We were young. We didn't know how to handle losing Dad. We made mistakes. Can we please sit down and talk like a family?" A few minutes later, Terrence added his layer. "I've been thinking about you a lot over the years," he typed. "I should have reached out sooner. I'm sorry. We can't change the past, but we can fix the future." I read their words carefully. If I had received them 20 years earlier, they might have melted me. In this life, at this stage, they read like scripts written for an audience they assumed I still was, the mother who waited, the woman who took any crumb as proof she was still loved. That woman had written her last letter to them and torn it up hours before. They tried memory next. "Remember when you used to make that peach cobbler and Dad would sneak spoonfuls before dinner?" Monique sent. "I miss those days. I miss you." Underneath, Terrence added, "I drove by the old house last week, thought about all the times you sat up late helping me with homework. You were a good mom even if we didn't show it." "Good mom." The words landed soft but late. Praise arriving after decades of absence did not feel like love. It felt like strategy. By evening, flattery joined the chorus. "You looked amazing on TV," Monique wrote. "You seem so strong. We're really proud of what you've built. You've done well for yourself." Proud, done well, built. The vocabulary of people assessing value. More messages followed, a drip of remorse, nostalgia, and compliments that felt like they had been measured out with a spoon. The air around my phone seemed heavier than the phone itself. I set it down on the dining table and walked away, letting the screen fade to black. Victor found me in the living room, sitting on the couch with my hands folded in my lap, eyes on the wall but seeing another lifetime. "More?" he asked. "Guilt this time," I said, dusted with sugar. He sat beside me, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel absent. "How does it land?" he asked. "Like a contract," I answered. "The kind where the fine print is, now that you're useful, we remember you." We sat together in the quiet, the kind that held both sadness and relief. I was sad for the years I had lost, for the version of myself who would have done anything to receive those messages. I was relieved that I was no longer her. Later that night, when the house was dark and Victor had gone upstairs, I picked up the phone again. A new message waited from Terrence. "Mom, things have been hard," it read. "The business is struggling. We're trying to hold everything together, but we can't. We didn't want to tell you because we were ashamed. We need guidance, maybe even help. Can we please meet and talk about everything?" The word help sat in the middle of the sentence like a stone. Guidance I could have offered all my life. Help I had begged for once, in hospital rooms and quiet kitchens. Neither had interested them back then. Monique followed close behind. "Mom, we're not asking just for money," she wrote. "We need our mother. We need your wisdom. You've built something big. Maybe there are opportunities, connections, or at least advice." There it was. Not outright greed, not blunt demand, but a slow reach. Fingers extended toward the life I had rebuilt without them. They did not mention the years I spent sick. They did not mention the messages they blocked. They did not mention the version of me who had once begged them to sit in my grief and been left standing alone. I set the phone down and looked at my hands. The ring Victor had placed on my finger caught the lamplight, a thin band that felt heavier than gold. I heard my own voice from that day, inside that small room where we had said our vows. I will never beg for love again, not even from my own children. I thought about the foundation, about the faces that turned toward me when I sat in those circles. I thought about Ariel and Sierra, the careful respect in their eyes. I thought about the woman who had torn up a letter that could have kept her tethered to a past version of herself and chosen instead to stand in the present. Another message came in, vibrating against the table. "Please, Mom," Terrence wrote. "Let us see you, just once, before things get worse for us. For us, not for me, not for what they had done, for them." I lifted the phone, opened the thread, and read every message again from start to finish. Guilt, flattery, desperation. Not once did I see a willingness to sit with what they had done without trying to turn it into a doorway back into my life. I sat there for a long time, the house wrapped around me like a witness. Then I opened a new reply. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking on an empty line. For the first time in 25 years, I began to type an answer. The cursor blinked on the empty screen like a heartbeat, patient and steady. For a long time, I just watched it. 25 years of silence on their side, 25 years of reaching, then surrender on mine, and now all of it sat in the space of one small reply box. The house was quiet. Evening light pressed soft against the curtains, turning the room gold at the edges. I could hear Victor moving in the kitchen, cabinets closing, the low murmur of the radio tuned to some old R&B station. Life. That's what it sounded like, simple, steady life, the kind I had once begged my children to step into with me. Terrence's last message hovered at the top of the thread. "Please, Mom, let us see you, just once, before things get worse for us." Those last two words were the truest part of everything they'd sent. For us, not for what had happened, not for what they had done, for their own unraveling. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who would have scrambled to answer, afraid that if she didn't, this would be her last chance. The one who counted chances like coins, hoarding them even when they brought her nothing but hurt. That woman had already written her goodbye on a yellow pad and torn it to pieces. I lowered the phone and closed my eyes. Images rose up, not in order, but in weight. The funeral pew, their bodies angled away from me. Boxes stamped, "Return to sender." The infusion chair with the empty seat beside it. Angela's hand on my shoulder. Victor's voice saying, "You don't have to be alone in this fight." Ariel and Sierra's quiet toasts. My name on a TV screen, not as a plea, but as a presence. I opened my eyes and lifted the phone again. My thumb moved slowly, each letter pulled from a place that had taken years to grow. No, I paused. It looked so small, so blunt, but it was honest, not cruel, not vengeful, just the truth. Another line. "Please do not contact me again." The words rested on the screen. Steady. I read them twice to be sure they belonged to me. They did. For years I had begged for contact that never came. Now, I was closing the door they had left open only when they smelled something they wanted from the other side. I added the last sentence, the one that mattered most, not for them, but for me. "I am at peace." I looked at all three lines together. There were 100 things I could have added. I could have listed every hurt, every holiday spent alone, every night I lay in a dark room wondering what I had done so wrong they could live as if I were already buried. I could have handed them a map of their failures and told them exactly where they had gotten lost. But I had already lived that. I didn't need to write it again. "Are you all right?" Victor's voice floated in from the doorway. I hadn't heard him walk in. He leaned against the frame, eyes soft, reading my face the way doctors read scans. "Yes," I said, and for once, the word was not a mask. "I think I am." He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body without him needing to touch me. "Whatever you send," he said, "make sure it tells the truth about who you are now, not who you had to be to survive them." I nodded and turned the screen slightly so he could see. He read the lines silently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "That's clear," he said finally. "And it's kind, in its own way." "The kindest thing I can do," I replied, "is not open a door I don't intend to hold." He nodded once, a small salute to the woman sitting there with the phone in her hand. Then he left me to it, respecting that this part of the journey, no matter how supported I was now, still had to be walked by me alone. I looked at the message one last time. No anger, no dramatics, no explanations, just a boundary carved clean after years of ragged edges. Then I pressed send. There was no fanfare, no dramatic sound. The message slid into the thread and settled beneath the flood of their words like a stone on the bottom of a river, unmoved by the current rushing over it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing bubbles appeared under Terrence's name, popped up, disappeared. Monique's indicator flashed once and then vanished, completely. Whatever words had been forming on their tongues met the wall I'd finally put up and fell silent. I went into the settings and opened each thread, Terrence first, then Monique. My thumb hovered for a moment over the option, a quiet question embedded in that tiny digital choice. Then I tapped block caller for both, confirming what my heart had already decided. The phone went still in my palm. No more previews, no more vibrations carrying their panic into my peace. I set it down on the table and sat back, feeling the weight roll off my shoulders in layers I hadn't noticed I was still holding. In the space their noise had occupied, there was only the sound of the radio in the kitchen and the faint clink of Victor rinsing dishes. The life I had built, a marriage, a foundation, a name that did not depend on their approval, stood quietly around me, solid as walls anchored deep into the ground. Whatever storm they were facing outside, whatever collapse they had finally admitted to, it stopped at my door. What I had rebuilt in their absence was standing now, full and whole. And this time, it could not be undone. The first time the foundation hosted its own event, not inside a hospital or borrowed room, I stood in the back for a while just to watch. People moved through the space with plates of finger food and cups of punch, name tags crooked on their chests. Some still had the faint look of patients' scarves, pale skin, careful steps. Others were years out of treatment, fuller in the face, laughter returning in pieces. They weren't there because they felt broken. They were there because they had survived and wanted to stay that way. On one wall, a simple banner read, "Hardy Survivorship Foundation Life, after the last drip." Under it, a slideshow played on loop, photos from support circles, community walks, quiet moments caught between sessions. Every now and then, my own face slipped across the screen, mid-sentence, eyes focused on someone just out of frame. Ariel stood near the volunteer table, handing out pamphlets to a couple who looked like they'd talked themselves into coming at the last minute. She nodded toward me as she spoke, and I saw the woman's shoulders relax just a little. Sierra was near the back door, organizing sign-up sheets, her brow furrowed in concentration. They moved through the room like they belonged not as owners, not as guards, but as part of something bigger than all of us. Victor found me near the punch bowl. "You're hiding," he said, smiling. "I'm observing," I corrected. "There's a difference." He slipped his hand into mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. "What do you see?" I looked around. People in small clusters, talking. A woman from one of our first groups laughing with a man I recognized from a later session. Angela collecting empty cups, still wearing that bright scarf. A few doctors off to the side, listening more than they spoke. "I see a life," I said quietly, "one I didn't know I was allowed to have." He nodded, not pressing for more. That was one of the first gifts he ever gave me, room to feel something without having to perform it. Later, at home, after the last chair had been stacked and the last light turned off at the center, I sat on the sofa with my feet tucked under a blanket. Ariel and Sierra had stopped by to drop off leftover programs, then stayed for tea and leftover cookies. They told us about exams, internships, little pockets of their own lives. When Sierra got up to leave, she hugged Victor first, then turned to me. "Good night, Mrs. Sidney," she said, the name warm and easy. "You can drop the Mrs.," I told her. "Sidney is fine." She smiled. "Sidney, then," she repeated, not trying to turn me into her mother, not keeping me at arm's length either, just finding the spot that fit. When the door closed behind them, the house settled into its familiar rhythm. No echoes, no hollow spaces begging to be filled, just rooms that knew who lived in them. I picked up the remote and flicked through channels until I landed on a rerun of the segment that had started all this noise. The station must have been replaying health features. Our interview appeared between stories about heart disease and diabetes. I watched myself walk onto the screen again, same dress, same calm posture. My name floated at the bottom. Sidney Langston, co-founder, Hardy Survivorship Foundation. I looked different to myself now than I had the night it first aired. Back then, I saw a woman bracing for impact, even if she didn't admit it. Tonight, I saw a woman who had already stood through the impact and stayed upright. On the screen, I heard my own voice say, "I healed alone, but I didn't stay alone." The camera cut to Victor listening beside me, to Patience nodding in the support circle, to a close-up of my hands loosely folded. My phone sat on the table, dark and still, no messages from names I used to wait on. They could no longer get through, not by phone, not by sudden remorse, not by panic wrapped in politeness. I had closed that door and stepped away from it. "I used to think I'd lost my family," I said quietly into the room. Half to Victor, half to myself. He glanced over from his chair. "And now?" he asked. Now, I thought of the people who spilled their fears in front of me and trusted me to hold them gently. I thought of Ariel and Sierra, who made room for me without asking me to erase anyone else. I thought of my husband rinsing dishes in our sink, humming low to himself. I thought of the woman who had once begged for love like it was oxygen, and the woman who now breathed just fine without a single hand reaching back from her past. "I didn't lose a family," I said, the truth settling into place as the words left my mouth. "I lost people who never wanted me." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything I had built when no one was looking, everything that had grown in the soil their absence left behind. The segment ended. The screen shifted to another story, then another. I turned the television off. The room dimmed, but nothing inside me did. Some things don't reverse. Not because they're broken, but because you finally walked too far to hear what once hurt you.